Fritz Lang's Scarlet Street hit theaters in 1945 like a sledgehammer to the moral sensibilities of post-war America. The film's unflinching portrayal of Edward G. Robinson as a middle-aged cashier, ensnared by a manipulative woman and driven to murder, shattered Hollywood's unwritten rules about sympathetic protagonists and redemptive endings. Lang, the German émigré who had already proven his mastery of darkness with M and Metropolis, crafted what critics describe as something almost sadistic in its psychological precision, a story where obsession leads not to catharsis but to spiritual damnation. What made Scarlet Street particularly incendiary wasn't just its subject matter, but Lang's refusal to offer audiences any moral comfort. The film's climax leaves Robinson's character alive but destroyed, haunted by voices of his victims while walking the streets as a broken man. This denial of either punishment or redemption violated the fundamental expectations of American cinema, where even the darkest stories typically concluded with some form of moral resolution. The backlash was swift and severe. New York, Atlanta, and Milwaukee banned the film outright, with censors declaring its themes of adultery and psychological manipulation too corrupting for public consumption. What particularly disturbed authorities was the film's suggestion that ordinary, respectable citizens could harbor such destructive impulses. Critics argue that Lang's vision presented a world where middle-class respectability was merely a thin veneer over primal desires and moral weakness. The controversy reached beyond simple moral objections. State censorship boards, despite the film's production code approval, found themselves grappling with a work that technically followed the rules while completely subverting their spirit. Film scholars suggest that Lang had created something that felt genuinely dangerous, not because of what it showed, but because of what it implied about the darkness lurking beneath suburban normalcy. Robert Aldrich's Kiss Me Deadly arrived in 1955 carrying the atomic age's deepest fears wrapped in Noir's familiar shadows. The film transformed Mickey Spillane's pulp detective Mike Hammer into something far more unsettling. A brutal anti-hero, navigating a world where the traditional criminal underworld had been replaced by something infinitely more terrifying, the specter of nuclear annihilation. What distinguished Kiss Me Deadly from its noir predecessors wasn't just its violence, though critics were quick to condemn Hammer's casual brutality towards suspects and women alike. The film's true innovation lay in its apocalyptic undercurrent, where the mystery solution wasn't stolen jewels or blackmail photographs, but a glowing suitcase containing what many interpreted as radioactive material capable of ending civilization itself. This wasn't merely crime fiction anymore. It was Cold War paranoia given cinematic form. The Catholic Legion of Decency didn't mince words, condemning the film for its sadism and amorality. Many critics argue that their moral outrage missed the deeper cultural anxiety Aldrich was channeling. Film scholars interpret the director as having crafted a detective story where the very act of investigation might trigger global catastrophe, reflecting America's growing unease with his own atomic capabilities and the knowledge that curiosity itself had become potentially lethal. Governmental scrutiny followed the moral condemnation, with various watchdog groups questioning whether such nihilistic entertainment served any constructive purpose during a period of national tension. The film's infamous climax, where opening the mysterious suitcase appears to unleash nuclear fire, became a lightning rod for debates about cinema's responsibility during the Cold War era. Fritz Lang's The Big Heat unleashed a level of gendered brutality that left 1953 audiences reeling in their theater seats. The film's notorious coffee-throwing scene, where gangster Vince Stone hurls scalding liquid into his girlfriend's face, represented an unprecedented escalation in cinema's willingness to depict violence against women with shocking immediacy and graphic consequence. What made this moment particularly groundbreaking wasn't simply the act itself, but Lang's unflinching camera work that refused to cut away or soften the impact. Gloria Graham's character bears the permanent disfigurement throughout the remainder of the film, her scarred face serving as a constant visual reminder of masculine rage unleashed without restraint. This wasn't the sanitized violence that Hollywood had previously offered. It was raw, intimate, and disturbingly personal. The film's relentless cycle of revenge created an atmosphere where brutality begat brutality with mechanical precision. When Detective Dave Banion's wife dies in a car bombing meant for him, his subsequent quest for vengeance transforms him into something barely distinguishable from the criminals he pursues. Lang constructed a moral universe where the line between law enforcement and organized crime had been obliterated by shared capacity for cruelty. Censorship boards found themselves confronting material that technically adhered to production codes while violating every unspoken boundary about acceptable screen violence. The film's corruption extended beyond individual characters to encompass entire institutions. Police departments, city governments, and newspaper offices all revealed as thoroughly compromised by criminal influence. Orson Welles' Touch of Evil opened in 1958 with a 3-minute tracking shot that redefined cinematic tension, following a ticking bomb through crowded border streets before culminating in an explosion that shattered more than just a car. It demolished Hollywood's comfortable assumptions about heroism and justice. The film's nightmarish vision of a corrupt Mexican border town where American law enforcement operated with impunity created a moral landscape so bleak that Universal Studios recoiled from Welles' original cut. The casting of Charlton Heston as Mexican narcotics officer Miguel Vargas sparked controversy, with critics, both contemporary and retrospective, condemning the decision as emblematic of Hollywood's systemic exclusion of Latino actors. While the most intense criticism emerged in later decades, some voices objected, even at the time. Heston himself later acknowledged the problematic nature of his role, admitting in his autobiography that the casting represented the industry's misguided practices of the era. Welles' portrayal of police captain Hank Quinlan as a grotesquely corrupt figure who plants evidence and manipulates investigations proved equally provocative. The character's methods, framing suspects, intimidating witnesses, and operating outside legal boundaries, presented law enforcement as fundamentally compromised by personal vendettas and institutional rot. This unflattering depiction of American authority figures operating in foreign territory carried uncomfortable implications about real-world power structures. Universal's extensive re-editing diluted much of Welles' subversive vision, reordering scenes and adding explanatory narration that simplified the film's complex moral ambiguities. When Walter Murch restored the film in 1998 using Welles' notes, audiences finally witnessed the director's intended critique of American imperialism and racial prejudice, a vision deemed too dangerous for mainstream consumption 4 decades earlier. Edgar G. Ulmer's Detour crawled out of Poverty Row in 1945 with a budget so meager that most studios would have spent more on catering, yet it delivered an existential gut punch that left audiences questioning the very nature of free will. The film's protagonist, Al Roberts, becomes trapped in a nightmare of circumstance where every decision leads deeper into moral quicksand, transforming a simple cross-country hitchhiking trip into a meditation on fate's cruel inevitability. What separated Detour from its contemporaries wasn't just its shoestring production values, but its absolute refusal to offer hope or redemption. While other noirs flirted with darkness before pulling back toward moral resolution, Ulmer's vision remained relentlessly bleak from opening frame to final fade. Roberts stumbles from one catastrophe to another, accidentally causing a driver's death, assuming his identity, then falling prey to the most vicious femme fatale in cinema history. Anne Savage's performance as Vera carved new territory for screen villainy, delivering dialogue with a snarling intensity that made previous noir antagonists seem almost genteel by comparison. Critics have described her character as possessing an almost supernatural ability to manipulate circumstances, turning Roberts into a puppet, dancing to her increasingly dangerous whims. The film's raw aesthetic, born from necessity rather than artistic choice, accidentally created a documentary-like authenticity that mainstream productions couldn't replicate. Cheap sets and minimal lighting enhanced rather than diminished the story's claustrophobic atmosphere, making Roberts' psychological imprisonment feel physically tangible. Samuel Fuller's pickup on South Street emerged in 1953 as a cinematic Molotov cocktail hurled directly at Cold War orthodoxy, featuring a pickpocket who stumbles into espionage while remaining utterly indifferent to patriotic duty. The film's protagonist, Skip McCoy, operates in New York's criminal underworld with complete disregard for national security concerns, treating communist secrets as merely another commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. Fuller's subversive masterstroke lay in positioning this amoral thief as America's unlikely defender against Soviet infiltration. When McCoy inadvertently steals microfilm containing atomic secrets, His motivations remain purely mercenary rather than patriotic. He simply wants to profit from the situation. This calculated cynicism toward traditional heroism infuriated FBI officials who condemned the film for suggesting that criminals could serve national interests better than government agents. The director's gritty portrayal of urban decay transformed Manhattan's Lower East Side into a morally ambiguous battlefield where loyalty could be purchased and ideological commitment meant nothing. Fuller populated this landscape with informants, double agents, and career criminals who navigated Cold War tensions with street-smart pragmatism rather than political conviction. Government pressure mounted as Fuller refused to sanitize his vision, insisting that individual action trumped institutional authority, even when that individual operated outside legal boundaries. This statement encapsulated the film's dangerous proposition that patriotism could be redefined through criminal acts, creating a precedent that would resonate through decades of American cinema increasingly skeptical of official narratives and institutional power. Samuel Fuller's The Naked Kiss exploded onto screens in 1964 with an opening sequence so jarring that audiences literally gasped. A bald woman beating a man with her purse before adjusting her wig and walking into the night. This wasn't mere shock value. Fuller had crafted a deliberate assault on middle-class sensibilities that would expose the rotting foundation beneath America's suburban facade. The film followed Kelly, a former prostitute seeking redemption in the fictional town of Grantville, only to discover that the respectability masked far more sinister corruptions than anything she'd encountered on city streets. Fuller's genius lay in inverting traditional moral hierarchies. The reformed sex worker became the story's moral compass, while pillars of the community revealed themselves as predators and hypocrites. What made The Naked Kiss genuinely revolutionary wasn't just its frank discussion of prostitution, but its unflinching examination of child sexual abuse perpetrated by those society deemed most trustworthy. When Kelly discovers the town's beloved benefactor harming a young girl, Fuller forced audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the institutions designed to protect the vulnerable. Censorship boards across the country condemned the film's explicit subject matter, with many theaters refusing to screen it entirely. Religious groups organized boycotts, while critics dismissed it as exploitation masquerading as social commentary. Fuller remained defiant, maintaining that confronting society's darkest secrets was essential rather than politely ignoring them. Night in the City unleashed itself upon 1950 audiences like a fever dream of post-war London, where every character clawed desperately for survival in a world designed to crush their ambitions. The film's protagonist, Harry Fabian, embodied the era's anxieties about social mobility, a small-time hustler whose grandiose schemes to break into wrestling promotion became a metaphor for the impossibility of escaping one's circumstances through sheer will alone. Jules Dassin's vision of London's criminal underworld stripped away any romantic notions of honorable thieves or noble outlaws. Instead, he presented an ecosystem of predators feeding on each other's weaknesses, where loyalty existed only as long as it served immediate self-interest. Richard Widmark's Fabian ricocheted between increasingly dangerous schemes, each failure driving him deeper into a web of debts and betrayals that tightened with mathematical precision. The film's most controversial element wasn't its violence or criminality, but its complete absence of sympathetic characters. Critics recoiled from a narrative populated entirely by grifters, loan sharks, and desperate opportunists who inspired neither pity nor admiration. Contemporary reviews complained that audiences had no one to root for, no moral center to anchor their emotional investment in the story's outcome. This deliberate alienation served Jules's larger purpose, creating a mirror for post-war society's own moral bankruptcy. The director populated his London with characters who had abandoned ethical considerations in favor of pure survival instinct, reflecting broader anxieties about civilization's fragility in the atomic age. Joseph H. Lewis's Gun Crazy burst onto screens in 1950 as cinema's most seductive celebration of lawlessness, transforming bank robbery into foreplay and murder into passion. The film's central couple, Bart Terre and Annie Laurie Starr, weren't just criminals, they were sexual revolutionaries whose shared obsession with firearms became a metaphor for dangerous desire that polite society couldn't acknowledge. Lewis crafted his most controversial sequences through groundbreaking camera techniques that placed audiences directly inside the criminal act. The film's legendary single-take bank robbery, shot entirely from the backseat of the getaway car, created an unprecedented sense of complicity that made viewers feel like accomplices rather than observers. This innovative approach transformed robbery from abstract crime into visceral experience, blurring the line between entertainment and participation. The film's most subversive element wasn't its violence, but its unapologetic romanticization of the outlaw lifestyle. While other crime films of the era punished their protagonists with death or imprisonment, many critics argued that Gun Crazy presented Bart and Annie as tragic lovers whose passions seemingly justified their crimes. Critics condemned this sympathetic portrayal, arguing that the film glamorized violence and some feared it might encourage copycat behavior among impressionable viewers. The controversy proved prophetic when Gun Crazy's template directly inspired Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde 17 years later. Penn openly acknowledged Lewis's influence, particularly the film's technique of making audiences emotionally invested in criminal protagonists. Nicholas Ray's In a Lonely Place dissected the American male psyche with surgical precision, transforming Humphrey Bogart's Dixon Steele into a walking embodiment of post-war masculine rage barely contained beneath a veneer of creative sophistication. The 1950 film refused to offer audiences the comfort of clear villains or heroes, instead presenting a screenwriter whose capacity for violence remained perpetually ambiguous, leaving viewers to grapple with their own complicity in his psychological unraveling. Ray's direction amplified the claustrophobia of domestic spaces, framing Dixon's relationship with neighbor Laurel Gray as a battleground where love and control became indistinguishable. The film's most disturbing sequences didn't involve murder or mystery, but rather the gradual erosion of trust between two people trapped in a cycle of suspicion and emotional manipulation. Bogart's performance stripped away his usual heroic charm, revealing a man whose creative frustrations manifested as barely suppressed hostility toward everyone around him. The production's most controversial element emerged from its unflinching examination of domestic abuse, particularly scenes where Dixon's jealousy transformed into physical intimidation. Ray fought censorship battles to retain moments that showed how emotional violence could be just as destructive as physical assault, creating a portrait of toxic masculinity that felt uncomfortably authentic to audiences accustomed to romanticized screen relationships. Critics recoiled from the film's bleak conclusion, which denied both justice and romantic resolution in favor of psychological truth. Dixon's guilt or innocence regarding the central murder remained deliberately unclear, forcing audiences to confront their own assumptions about masculine behavior and the thin line between passion and pathology. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.